It was an ordinary afternoon, like so many others, and Ethan Johnson was inside a small but busy supermarket. He was there, between the shelves, carefully looking at the labels on the products and choosing what he would take home. Nothing special, so far just a normal shopping day, far from any hustle and bustle. Deep down, Ethan knew that the things that really mattered weren't on the shelves in front of him. He was thinking about how he would need to organize his study schedule for college this week and the weight of the responsibilities he always carried with him. Walking through the aisles, Ethan's eyes fixed on each item. A bottle of milk, a box of cereal, fresh fruits, and even some treats for the days of exhaustion. He thought about his family's habits, always concerned with health, but also with the joy of life's little pleasures. This shopping routine wasn't just an obligation, but a reflection of his simple life, of someone who always valued small moments. In the back of his mind, he remembered his family's stories, how his grandfather had faced World War II, how his father had worked hard to ensure he received a quality education, even if it meant many sacrifices. These stories gave him strength to face the tough days. Like a light shadow, he felt their weight as he picked out the products. As he moved away from the dairy section and headed to the meat aisle, his thoughts were interrupted by something he didn't expect. He noticed an elderly lady ahead of him, walking hurriedly. She seemed to be looking for something, but didn't seem to care much about the people around her. It was Margaret O'Connor, a woman known in the town. She had always been a person with a strong personality, sometimes difficult to deal with. Margaret's steps were quick and firm, but her face was marked by impatience, as if the world around her was slowing down while she wanted everything to move faster. Ethan tried to look away and continue with his task, but Margaret, with a gaze filled with disdain, approached him. She stopped beside him, not greeting him or showing any form of courtesy. She just stared at him with an intense look. For a moment, Ethan felt unsettled. He knew something was about to happen, but he didn't expect it to be at that moment. In the quiet aisles of the supermarket, Margaret let out a loud sigh, clearly annoyed by something, and made an impatient gesture with her hands. Then, without any introduction or softness, she spoke. "You should go back to Africa." Her words, simple and cruel, hung in the air. The sound of her voice, filled with an unbearable contempt, shattered the silence that had previously reigned in the supermarket. Suddenly, the atmosphere around them seemed to freeze. Ethan stood still, unsure of how to react at first. Some people in the aisle began to glance at them, and a heavy silence took over the place. Ethan's eyes did not leave Margaret, who, in turn, seemed completely indifferent to the reactions of the others. He took a deep breath, trying to absorb the impact of her words, but he didn't let himself be consumed by anger. He knew that type of attitude, having faced it before. However, in that moment, something inside him sparked. Instead of staying silent or reacting impulsively, he felt a strength he didn't know he had. He knew he couldn't let that comment go without a response. The supermarket, once just a neighborhood store, now seemed like a stage where a moment of tension was about to unfold. The atmosphere around Ethan and Margaret had shifted. The ordinary had given way to the unexpected, and what had seemed like a simple day of shopping had turned into something much bigger. The air in the supermarket was heavy. It felt as if the world around them had shrunk, and all that existed was the tension between Ethan and Margaret. The words she had said kept echoing in Ethan's mind, as if he were hearing them in slow motion, repeated over and over. "You should go back to Africa." It was such a simple and cruel comment that he didn't know how to react, or even what to feel. The sense of discomfort took over the place. The people around them, who had seemed lost in their own shopping before, now watched intently, some with curiosity, others clearly embarrassed, but no one said anything. The sound of voices and footsteps faded. Everything seemed to revolve around that one sentence. There was no doubt that the lady was standing there before Ethan with her air of superiority, waiting for something. Perhaps a reaction of anger, maybe a confrontation. And Ethan, in the middle of all that, was trying to find the right words, but wasn't sure if he had them. Margaret standing in front of him, didn't seem to realize the impact of her words. She looked at him with an expression as if she had already said what she wanted, as if it were a common opinion, something she believed to be true, without question. She wasn't expecting an answer. She was waiting for something like a sign of weakness, something she could use to further justify what she had just said. Ethan felt the blood rising up his throat but remained calm. He knew he couldn't act impulsively. He knew that any reaction fueled by anger or frustration would only make things worse. So he took a deep breath, as he had learned to do since he was young, when life seemed too hard to bear. He thought of the stories of his family, the struggles, the victories, the daily challenges. Everything his ancestors had faced could not be erased by a single sentence from a woman who didn't even know him. He looked at Margaret, his eyes steady, trying to understand the root of her cruelty. "You don't know me," he said with a surprising calmness that even he was impressed by. It wasn't an aggressive response. It was a simple but profound statement. It was as if he were not only responding to her but also trying to understand what was happening in that moment, trying to free himself from the feeling of being judged for something he couldn't change. Margaret furrowed her brow, not understanding his reaction. She had expected something different, perhaps a confrontation, a fight, but what she got was something she clearly didn't know how to handle: dignity. And that left her somewhat confused. She hesitated for a second, and Ethan noticed that maybe she had been expecting him to respond with the same arrogance and hatred, but he didn't. He looked at her and continued, "I don't need to go anywhere. I'm from here. My family is from here, and I'm a part of it. You are too, aren't you? But that doesn't make you better than anyone else." The supermarket, which had been in an almost deathly silence, began to shift. The people who had only been watching from a distance began to move a little closer, as if they were being pulled into the moment. Some whispered, others exchanged glances. Ethan was starting to realize that his words weren't just for Margaret, but for everyone around them. He wasn't just defending himself. He was questioning with his posture the attitudes of those who remained silent in the face of prejudice. Margaret, in turn, didn't know what to do with this. She tried to look away, but Ethan noticed she was beginning to feel the weight of his words. She wanted another fight, another justification for her hatred, but Ethan wasn't giving that to her. He wasn't at her mercy anymore, and that made her visibly uncomfortable. The silence hung in the air, but it didn't last long. Margaret, with a firm gaze and no sign of remorse, seemed determined not to be shaken by Ethan's words. On the contrary, she became even more rigid, as if she had prepared for a fight, though no one around them seemed interested in one. And that was when she allowed herself to continue. "You don't have the right to tell me what to do, boy," Margaret said, her voice louder now. "I don't know how your people are still here, stealing our jobs, always playing the victim. I know exactly how you all are." Ethan didn't know what to say anymore. Her anger seemed endless, and he could already feel the tension rising once again. She wasn't willing to listen, and it seemed that no matter how calm he tried to stay, she only wanted to provoke him further. Her gaze was filled with pure hostility, as though she were on a mission to humiliate not just him, but anyone who dared challenge her views. "You talk about history, but I see what I see every day," Margaret continued, not caring that she was being observed by a growing audience. "This country wasn't made for you. I'm not racist. I'm just speaking the truth." Her words fell heavy, like stones in a once tranquil river. She wasn't just ignoring Ethan's dignity. She was trying to force a perspective that he knew was wrong. Each word she spoke was an attempt to push him into a corner, to belittle his very existence there, and it seemed to be spreading like a disease. The air grew thicker. Ethan felt the heat rising in his chest, but he couldn't afford to give in to anger. He knew that if he were like her, this would spiral into something much worse. But his patience was wearing thin. He could feel the disapproving stares around him, but he also felt a kind of pressure, as if the weight of those words was on him, and he was the only one responsible for keeping them in check. But deep down, he knew he wasn't alone. He couldn't. "You're wrong," he replied, and his voice wasn't as calm as before, but still controlled. "I don't need your approval to exist. I'm as American as anyone else here. Maybe more so than you, because unlike you, I don't try to put others down to feel superior." Margaret, hearing that, snorted in disdain, her gaze sharpening. She moved a little closer, challenging him, as if she were expecting a more aggressive response from Ethan. But he didn't budge. He simply stared at her without raising his voice, and what seemed like a battle of wills had now turned into a contest of strength. Who would yield first? She wanted to see his anger. She wanted to see his humiliation. But Ethan wasn't going to give that to her. "You're just another one of those sons of B-keys who think they can say whatever they want just because society lets them," Margaret continued, her eyes narrow as if trying to provoke a response, a weakness from Ethan. She was without a filter, no boundaries. She wasn't at all concerned with who was listening. The atmosphere was becoming more charged. The people around, who had merely been watching before, were now in an uncomfortable position. Some were starting to whisper to each other. Others murmured words of disapproval, but no one dared to intervene. Everyone was just watching, as if they were waiting for Ethan to do something, anything, to resolve this. But he didn't want to. React with hate. He knew that this woman had much more in her mind than he could understand. And he also knew that in moments like this, it wasn't just him who was being tested, but everyone around them. "I'm not going to fight with you, ma'am," Ethan said, trying to keep his composure. "But I will ask that one day you look at what you say and think about the consequences. What you call truth isn't everyone's truth. It's not mine. It's not the truth of many people here." Margaret flinched, but she wasn't ready to back down. She crossed her arms with a defiant look, as though she were expecting the whole world to agree with her words. And while Ethan stood there, face to face, with her, he felt growing frustration, but also a sense of clarity. He knew that in this moment he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for everyone around him. Hearing all of this, perhaps feeling the weight of discrimination in a way he already knew all too well. But Margaret didn't yield. She was there, completely closed off in her own world of hatred and prejudice, unwilling to listen, not even giving a chance for a conversation. She was determined to hold on to her superiority, and nothing Ethan said would change that. The supermarket now felt like a silent war zone. Everyone was tense, waiting for something more to happen. Margaret was winning her game of provocation, but Ethan wouldn't move. He would stand firm, and only when she tired of the game would it end. But until then, he would have to endure her cruel words because, sadly, some battles aren't won in the moment. The air was heavy, as if time had slowed down. The supermarket, once a place for everyday shopping, now felt like a silent battlefield, with Ethan and Margaret at the center of it all, engaged in an invisible struggle. The woman stood there, unyielding, with an expression that suggested she had said everything she wanted to say, and was now waiting for some kind of response that would validate her worldview. Ethan, on the other hand, felt an increasing pressure but refused to give, to the urge to shout or let anger consume him. He knew there was something more important to do. The gazes around them were all fixed on the two of them, as if no one knew how to act, as if they were waiting for him to take responsibility for changing the course of the situation. Ethan realized he was not alone in this moment. Margaret's words had touched a sensitive spot, not only in him, but in everyone around them. What was at stake was not just his dignity, but what he represented to those who were watching. The supermarket, now almost devoid of its usual sounds, had become a stage for something much deeper. He looked at Margaret, her eyes still filled with contempt, perhaps waiting for a new reaction, an insult. But what she didn't know was that Ethan had prepared for something much bigger than an exchange of insults. He knew it wouldn't be worth losing control. He knew that how he responded here would not only affect the moment but might leave a mark on the people watching. He didn't want to be remembered as just another person who gave in to provocation. And then, with a calmness that defied the situation, he began to speak. "I know what you're trying to do," Ethan said, his voice firm but not angry. "You want me to believe that I'm different, that I don't belong here. But the truth is, I've seen this before. This isn't the first time someone has tried to make me feel like I don't have the right to be here, and I know it won't be the last." Margaret looked at him, frowning, but he continued, undeterred. "You know, ma'am, my great-grandfather was enslaved, right? And my grandfather fought in World War II to defend this country. He fought not only against Nazism, but also against a system that still believed people like him didn't have the right to be free. My parents, they spent years fighting, working just to make sure I had a chance to study, to have a better life." Ethan paused, feeling the weight of his own words. He wasn't just speaking about his own history. He was speaking of a history, of resistance, of generations who, against all odds, continued to fight for dignity. He felt a deep connection to his family, as though his words were transcending the moment, touching something grander. And despite everything we've been through, the pain, the struggle, the sacrifice, someone still tries to tell me I don't have the right to be here? I am the child of a history of resistance, of courage, and no matter what you think, I'm just as American as anyone else here. My place is here. My right to live, to dream, to be who I am, is just as valid as yours." He looked around at the people, feeling their gazes shifting between him and Margaret. Some were attentive. Others had their hands on their faces, clearly moved. Some just watched, perhaps waiting to see how far he would go with this. "I'm not here to fight with you," Ethan continued, now calmer, more reflective. "I don't need that. I just want you to understand that the words you say are not just words. They carry weight. They hurt. I'm not a victim, but I won't be silent anymore in the face of those who try to diminish who I am. And I will continue to fight, to study, to work, and to live, because my life, the life of all of us, matters. It's not what you think of me that defines who I am. It's what I do with my life." Silence once again filled the supermarket. Ethan's words hung in the air, and he felt at the same time that he was releasing a weight, but also offering everyone there a chance to see the situation from a new perspective. He wasn't asking for sympathy. He wasn't asking for applause. He just wanted everyone to see the truth, a truth that might not be comfortable, but was real. Margaret, on her part, was completely paralyzed. She hadn't expected that reaction. She wanted to humiliate him, to make Ethan feel small, insignificant. But he wasn't shaken. He didn't give in. She didn't know how to respond, because Ethan's words weren't just about him. They were about everyone else who had long been silenced. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to try to discredit his speech, but for some reason, something seemed to stop inside her. The words just wouldn't come out. Ethan, no longer expecting anything from Margaret, looked at those around them. He didn't need to say anything more. He knew something had shifted, even if subtly. Maybe, as they looked at him, people now saw the power that lay in words and dignity, even in a moment of adversity. He hadn't won a fight. But in some way, he had gained something much bigger. He had planted a seed of reflection, and who knows, perhaps that small act could spark something greater, something that would change more than just an afternoon of shopping in a supermarket. The silence after Ethan's words was almost palpable, as if time had suddenly stopped. The people around them, who had been simply doing their shopping moments before, now seemed completely immersed in the scene. The environment, once busy and normal, had been replaced by a rising tension. Even the sound of shopping carts and food packaging seemed muffled, as if the entire world was waiting for the next move. Margaret, standing there before Ethan, seemed a much smaller figure than before. The anger and contempt that had dominated, her gaze were beginning to give way to doubt, perhaps even discomfort. She hadn't expected him to respond that way, with such firmness, and now, deep down, it seemed she realized she had crossed a line. But she didn't want to admit it. She didn't want to be the one to apologize, to show regret. She wanted to continue her walk as if nothing had happened, as if her words hadn't made any impact. Ethan, for his part, felt a mix of emotions. The frustration still burned inside him, but now he was more focused on what would come next. He knew that no matter how firm and clear his words had been, the real impact of those words was just beginning. It wasn't just about him or Margaret. It was about everyone around them who might never have been confronted with the reality of racism so directly. Then, the reactions began to appear. First, a soft sigh from an elderly woman in the line next to them, who looked at Margaret and shook, her head as if mourning what was happening. "I agree with him," she said softly but audibly. "These things don't have a place here. They never have." Some of the other customers, who had been tense and quiet, began to look at Margaret. With disapproval, a young woman pushing a cart with products lifted her head and made an almost imperceptible gesture, a look of disapproval. Whispers began to spread, no longer out of curiosity but out of indignation. Margaret, who had once seemed so confident and dominant, was now feeling the weight of the collective gaze. She tried to respond, but her voice no longer had the same power. "I didn't say anything wrong," she said, trying to justify herself, but her voice was faltering, almost pleading for understanding. She looked at Ethan, perhaps hoping he would show some sign of weakness, but he didn't give in. He stood, firm, unmoving, his expression unchanged. "It's not what you said, Margaret," Ethan replied calmly, his voice still resonating like an echo in the ears of those around them. "It's the impact your words have. They're not just words. They reflect how you see the world and what you think you have the right to do to others. And yes, your words affected me, but they affected many more people who are hearing this. You can't just throw poison in the air and expect it not to spread." The elderly woman who had agreed with Ethan stepped forward, looking at Margaret with determination. "I have grandchildren," she said, her voice trembling but full of emotion. "And I don't want them to grow up in a world where people think they can say anything and get away with it. I'm against that, against any kind of hatred." The woman's words seemed to have an immediate effect. Others began to approach, and soon a small crowd of customers had gathered around Ethan. Some were still processing what had just happened, but others were already standing up to Margaret, as if they had finally seen the truth behind the facade. Disapproving glances were now directed at her, and the tension was visibly shifting. Margaret, bothered by the situation, tried to justify herself once more. "I'm not racist," she said, her voice lower and more insecure. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. I was just speaking the truth. It was just a comment." But Ethan already knew that wasn't an excuse. He knew that racism often disguised itself as opinion or freedom of speech. But Margaret's words weren't just an innocent comment. They carried decades of prejudice and ignorance, and Ethan knew that it wasn't just about correcting her in that moment, but confronting all those who thought the same way. "It doesn't matter if you think you're not racist," Ethan responded, firmly. "What matters is that what you said has weight, and the impact of your words is now in the minds of everyone here. Maybe this will make you think about what you're really saying when you speak those things." The atmosphere in the supermarket was changing drastically. The people around them began to form a small community, sharing their own experiences, some more subtle, others more direct. Many started to distance themselves from Margaret, visibly uncomfortable, and she realized that things were slipping out of her control. Yet even then, she remained silent, her pride almost destroyed by a reality she didn't know how to deal with. Ethan, for his part, didn't feel victorious. He didn't want anyone to see him as a hero. He didn't want applause. All he wanted was for people, after hearing that conversation, to start thinking about the impact of words, about how we are, all responsible for the things we say, and how those words can either build or destroy. The tension gradually began to dissipate, and the supermarket started returning to normal. People went back to their shopping, but something had already changed. The silence and insecurity of Margaret, the empathy and courage of Ethan, had touched a point of reflection for everyone there. More than a simple confrontation, that moment had become a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone watching, and perhaps even for Margaret, who, as she hurriedly left the supermarket, was leaving behind not only a charged atmosphere, but also a missed chance to understand the depth of the words she had tried to justify. The sound of the shopping cart slowly gliding across the supermarket floor became the predominant noise once again, but the atmosphere still carried the tension of the moment. Margaret, who had been so confident before, now seemed like a shadow of her former self. She didn't know how to proceed, how to return to what she had been doing, how to handle the weight of the others' gazes. Her steps were hurried, unsure, as if every movement was meant to get away from a place that bothered her, but at the same time she couldn't leave it calmly. She passed quickly by the shelves, her face flushed and her eyes avoiding everything and everyone until she finally reached the supermarket exit. Ethan watched from a distance, still feeling a slight tremor in the palms of his hands. He wasn't satisfied. He wasn't celebrating the fact that he had made Margaret leave the supermarket. The truth was, he didn't want anyone to leave a place out of shame or fear, but rather to understand the weight of their own actions. However, in that moment, there was nothing more to be done. He knew the effect of his words was still echoing in the air, and he couldn't control others' reactions. He took a deep breath, trying to recover. The looks from the people around him, who had previously been passive observers, now seemed filled with respect. Some gave him shy smiles. Others spoke softly in support, almost as if they were still surprised by what had just happened. But Ethan knew that the support wasn't about him, nor about the moment itself. It was about something greater. It was about the idea that by not allowing racism and prejudice to go unchallenged, he had sparked a small change, even in a simple place like that supermarket. He looked around, the room still breathing a little more slowly, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. People were drawing closer, and he could see in their eyes a need to talk, to get involved, to reflect. They had witnessed something happen, something that touched everyone's humanity directly, and now they were, in some way, connected through that experience. A young woman approached him, someone who had been in the line next to him with a respectful demeanor and a slight hesitation in her gaze. "Sorry, I couldn't help but overhear. I just wanted to say that I really admire what you did. I don't know what I would have done if I were you," she said, her voice soft but full of sincerity. Ethan looked at her, unsure of how to respond. He still felt the tension in his body, the weight of the situation, but also a sense of something lighter, as if the words he had spoken had created space for something different. He wasn't alone. None of us were. And that small act of courage, of standing up against what was wrong, seemed to be weaving an invisible thread between him and the others. "I just did what was right," Ethan replied with a small smile, trying to deflect attention away from himself. "But it's not easy. It's not a fight you choose, but it's the only fight we have." He paused, feeling the moment. You have to be prepared to tell the truth, even when it puts you at the center of everything. And sometimes you just need courage to speak, even when it feels like the world is going to fall down on you. The young woman nodded, understanding the depth of Ethan's words. She looked at him as if waiting for more, but before she could say anything else, a man who had been standing behind her approached. He was middle-aged with a serious air, but his eyes held something gentler. "I was listening too," he said, his voice deep. "I can't speak the way you did, but I know that most of us are afraid to confront these kinds of situations. I just wanted to say that you did something many of us don't have the courage to do. You helped open the eyes of a lot of people here today." Ethan simply nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. Their words echoed in the back of his mind, and he knew he had done the right thing, not for him, but for the truth that needed to be shared. Meanwhile, Margaret was already outside, still in the supermarket parking lot, her face still red, her eyes filled with silent frustration. She had left, but her departure wasn't an act, a victory for her. It was the result of a confrontation she didn't know how to handle. She wasn't regretful, not at that moment. She didn't understand the impact of her words, but she knew that something inside her had changed. She felt shame, but it wasn't the kind of shame that would lead her to reflect on what she had done. It was more the discomfort of knowing that, in that moment, she no longer had control of the situation. As she walked toward her car, a voice in her mind nudged her. questioning everything that had happened. She had never imagined her words could provoke such a strong reaction. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was starting to wonder if there was something wrong with the way she viewed the world. Back inside the supermarket, Ethan began to resume his shopping, passing by the shelves with his mind still processing everything that had transpired. He didn't want to think about Margaret anymore, or the impact this would have on her life, because the truth was, he couldn't control any of it. He was simply doing his part. He wanted to be someone who acted with dignity, with courage, but without creating the idea of a hero. What he knew was that if this moment could awaken something in the people around him, if it made someone see things from a different angle, then he had fulfilled his role. He wasn't seeking revenge or retribution. He just wanted to be heard, like all of us do. And on that day, he had succeeded. As he passed through the checkout line, a few people looked at him with more respect, smiles of recognition emerging, but he wasn't seeking applause. He knew the real work wasn't there, but in the impact his words would have in the coming days. After all, the world wouldn't change with a simple act, but maybe it was possible to begin a change with something small, a conversation, an attitude, a moment of courage. When he finally left the supermarket, the cool afternoon air enveloped him. He felt light, but also aware that the struggle was far from over. But for now, he had done what he could, and for a brief moment, he knew he was at peace with that.